so there's a commonly used phrase in the field called the biotech valley of death, which is like right at about the point where you've got a really interesting assay or a validation of an animal model. You've been able to attract grant funding, and you have your scientists of whatever flavor, you know, professors, PhDs, postdoctoral students, pushing that science forward. And then it reaches a point where it has to spin out into a company and attract some new early stage funding. But that funding is now so far from the clinic, right? You're still 9 years or so on average from your market approval for that drug, that finding the funding to go in a serious way to build that technology into a therapeutic that will make it all the way through your preclinical development, clinical trials, and then market approval is very rare. There are a few groups around who do that very, very, very well, especially like Boston, San Francisco, London-based biotech venture capital firms. And then pharma companies can do that very well. But there aren't so many of those actors compared to the quantity of research being generated in every major city around the world. And so a lot of biotechs get started and then almost immediately stumble by failing to find funding or finding the right strategy to go forward, which is why we call it the biotech valley of death, because it's just, it's a tough transition where someone who's a basic research scientist enters a world where all of a sudden the next step for their invention has to do with all of these fields that they've never really had to care about before. And so there's, yeah, quite a transition that needs to happen. And there are a couple of those in the biotech world.
So in simple terms, what is the main bottleneck? Is it primarily funding?
I would argue not really. It's a combination of money and strategy. I mentioned just now that there are a couple of transitions that let's say a compound has to go through in its development, right? When it goes from understanding the basic science and kind of the development of an assay to the development of a compound, and then usually the optimization and toxicity testing for that compound, which is a completely different field, right? It can go from like, yeah, basic biology to animal models to like synthetic chemistry and physiology for the tox piece. And then it switches again and goes to the clinical piece where you need to say like, okay, here's how we're going to appeal to clinicians and so on. And then it has to switch again to go to the market piece where you talk about pricing and reimbursement from insurance companies and so on. And each of these steps, a lot of groups have a ton of trouble crossing from one side to the other. And so finding a partner that can enable a company, or let's even not call it a company, let's call it a project, right? Enable a project to jump from A to B to C is really the biggest value there. And yes, it does take a lot of money, but I think money is just one part of the equation.
Is the regulatory structure a major hurdle with translation?
I don't spend too much of my time talking with the FDA or the EMEA in Europe. I think that they have pretty clear rules, and especially in the last decade have been, you know, much more responsive than they ever have been in the past. I think that overall the regulators are doing a pretty good job of things. The tougher part in my mind has been the stuff that comes before the FDA. How are you identifying and validating your drug before you ever start a clinical trial? How are you optimizing it to make sure that it has the maximum chance of being safe in humans? How are you setting up your company so that even if the first drug that you go in fails for some unforeseen reason, that the whole project isn't jeopardized from this one unexpected failure? These are all of the sort of things that I think are the biggest stumbling blocks for early stage biotech companies that I spend most of my time dealing with. Certainly regulatory approval is a big one that we're always thinking about, but the whole company should be built in such a way that regulatory approval is achievable if you meet certain clinical milestones, and the return on investment for investors is certainly there in pharma. We can talk a bit about that later, but from a returns perspective, it's actually has been in the past decade better for investors to put money into early stage biotech companies than to early stage tech companies. Which, given how everyone talks about Facebook and Airbnb and Uber and all of these other things, it's kind of an interesting statistic that pharma companies have actually been doing better.
Yeah.
But yeah, so even given that, the point is that the return on investment is there, the regulatory structure is working and rewarding those drugs that succeed. It's just that not all of them are able to get there. And that's partially a funding bottleneck and partially a strategic bottleneck.
As an investor, how do you choose projects with good prospects?
So if you ask any VC investor, they will give you some statistics about what they call their deal flow ratio, which is basically how many projects do I see every year versus how many do I invest in. And the reality is, for almost all investors, you see a whole lot for every one that becomes an investment. Apollo is a little bit different than many other investors in both our appetite for risk and stage, but also our willingness to go in and build something that doesn't exist yet. So we have a very clear focus in the biology of aging, right? Which to us means a rather defined set of things. And so we have been going out, seeing scientific presentations, often even before there's a paper published, talking with researchers, going to conferences, etc. And then because my whole team, my diligence team is scientists, we go in, we get excited about some specific scientific aspect. We've all been trained a little bit on the translational side, like seeing what other biotech companies are doing, and then jointly hatch plans to say, like, okay, this is how this would work if we turn this into a biotech company. And I think that starts with just exceptional science that is right at this unique stage where it's ready to jump from, bench to biotech, let's say, right? Where it's an academic project that has proof of concept in some way. So sometimes in animal or even in animal models, whether it's mammalian or a lower organism, and then potentially a compound that already exists in addition to a target, but usually not an optimized compound. And then we jump from, and if it hits that check mark in a way, where you've got this, it's a very, very cool, novel mechanism of action, then you go and dive one level deeper to say, like, okay, is there a way to turn this into a biotech company that makes strategic sense? And if all of those check boxes are hitting, then you say, like, okay, how can we make this work? And then you have to, go through the next steps, which is pulling together a team, launching something, and then growing it. But I think that how we find it starts and ends with identify great science in the aging space.
Is there anything in particular that you avoid, anything that you watch for as a bad sign?
Interesting. Yes, tougher question, but I think a good one. So red flags to me as an investor include going for dementias as a primary indication. there's all sorts of really, really fascinating research going on right now with Alzheimer's disease. And I think that there are a number of interesting theories, including ones about metabolism, about lysosomal degradation, different ways of targeting both tau and beta together, et cetera. Like there's all sorts of interesting ways to go after Alzheimer's disease, and many of them apply to Parkinson's as well, that are fascinating. And I think some of them are absolutely going to work, but the history of biotech companies makes investments in this space, in specific projects that only have applicability to Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, or want to go after those things first, incredibly difficult to fund. Alzheimer's trials, there have been 200 or so since 2000, and there have only been 2 successes out of those 200, and neither of those has created a disease-modifying drug. And so while there's still a lot of appetite for something new, being able to wrap those new things in a shell of like, there's a safer piece to it and then a more exciting piece behind it is kind of core to how we think about the Alzheimer's space from a business perspective, even if there's, from those parts that I just discussed before, animal models and a market strategy and good scientists and so on, even if those are all check marks for Alzheimer's, we're still always a little bit cagey about it, just because it takes so much money and it's so risky to do a big phase 3 Alzheimer's trial. I would add to that especially in our space, right, in this geroscience space, most of the work suggests that intervening early in Alzheimer's is the best way to intervene and prevent the continued degradation of memory. And that makes the trials that you would potentially perform for a drug like that even longer, tougher, more challenging, with a higher bar for safety and efficacy.